Welcome. My name is Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and you've joined us on Catholic Truth.
Hi everyone, my name is Kate. I'm the video editor here at Catholic Truth, and I just wanted to say on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for taking some time to watch our videos and learn more about your faith. You guys really make this channel possible, and we truly appreciate you being here. So thanks again, and God bless.
Today we're going to talk about a really interesting topic, the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, and purgatory. So I guess it's really five last things. It's a topic that is somewhat a little bit scary, perhaps for some people to talk about, and maybe a little bit morbid or unpleasant, but it's something that all of us are going to have to face, and we can't ignore the reality of the afterlife. So first, death. A lot of times we don't want to think about our own death, but death is assured. In fact, it's probably the only thing that we can be 100% sure is going to happen to us in this life. So what happens when we die? Well, the basic answer is that our body and soul separate. Our soul goes on to the afterlife, our body stays here on this earth. In fact, the Church defines death in one of two different ways. First, it's the complete cessation, so there's no more heartbeat or breathing. If that occurs, then a person is dead. The other way the Church defines death is if there's no brain activity at all, including the brain stem. Why is this important? Because if grandma is in the hospital and she's on a ventilator and maybe she doesn't have much brain activity, but the brain stem is still working, then she is still alive. This means that she can still receive the sacraments. This means that she still has the dignity of a living human being, that we can't pull the plug, as they say. We have to respect that because they're still actually alive. So those are the two ways in which we determine death. Either there's no heartbeat and no breathing, or there's no brain activity, including the brain stem, which deals with all of your involuntary muscles like digestion and things like that. The one thing that we know in life is that death is certain, and is something that we have to be aware of. In fact, many of the early Christians found that to be a very powerful meditation. It was often called memento mori, remember your death. The Carthusians, which are a religious community of men who are very strict in their observance, they greet one another with those words, remember your death, brother. I don't know about you, but that's not what I want to hear when I come down for coffee in the morning, remember your death. But it's a good way to kind of consider every day, remember your death. St. Jerome used to have a skull that he would place on his bookshelf or on his desk when he was doing his writing, in order to remind himself constantly that everything he was doing, he was going to die at some point. Because a lot of times you can kind of take pride and be puffed up and think, man, everything I'm doing is so great. But then you look at the skull and you realize, that's going to be me someday. In fact, there's a very fascinating church in Rome, which is often called the Bone Chapel. It was a church called it once every 1,000 years. When Mount Everest was as flat as sea level, eternity begins. So eternity is very long, and that helps us to keep this life very much in perspective. So after death, what happens? Well, immediately we go into judgment. In fact, this is the first of two types of judgment. We call this the particular judgment. This is where we stand before Christ and we see reflected in Him our entire life. Now, I want to be very clear. Ultimately, it is us who judge ourselves. God desires our holiness. He desires our happiness. He wants us to come to heaven. But it's up to us to respond. It's kind of like this. If someone sends you an invitation, that means they want you to be with them for this party or this event. But it's up to us to write back and say, yes, I desire to come, and then to actually show up. Because sending the invitation itself is not enough to have you come. You have to make that response and make that effort. In the same way, Christ desires every human being to spend eternity with Him in heaven, and He will do anything possible to make that happen. He has sent us the invitation written in His Son's blood. But it's up to us to say yes. And we say yes through our faith that is then lived out by the way in which we live. And so if in the afterlife we realize that we have not responded with a yes to that invitation, if we responded with, no, or, I'd rather do my own will rather than God's, then the answer is, well, you've chosen no for this answer. So we have to understand it's not so much God judging us, but rather that we judge ourselves. And when we stand before the face of Him who is truth itself, there's no hiding. There's no making excuses. There's no way we can say, well, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. Because all of our excuses will be stripped away. All of the things we thought were so important, good reasons why we can sin, all of a sudden we'll realize that none of that holds any weight when we stand before God who is pure truth and pure love. So after our judgment, there's one of three different options: heaven, hell, or purgatory. Let's talk about hell for a moment, get the worst one out of the way. St. Faustina had a vision of hell. In fact, a number of saints have had visions of hell. St. Jacinta and Francisco Marta, the visionaries of Fatima, saw hell. But in St. Faustina's vision of hell, she noticed that there were 6 different types of suffering in hell. The first type of suffering is the fact that they will never see God. What great sadness that will be, to know that the separation from God is eternal because they've chosen it. They've chosen to be away from God. The second type of suffering of hell is the company of the devils and the other damned. Imagine in heaven you get to see all of your family and friends and be in the company of the saints. But conversely, in hell you're only in the company of these evil, wicked demons and the company of other people who are as miserable as you are. A third suffering of hell is the constant remorse of our conscience. We just wish we had done it better. We wish we had chosen differently. But we haven't, because we are who we are. The fourth type of suffering is to know that the sufferings are eternal, that they're never going to go away. The fifth type of suffering is what she calls a spiritual flame, causing spiritual pain. And you say, well, what is spiritual pain? Well, anybody who's ever experienced depression or anxiety or any kind of mental illness knows that there's a lot of types of pain that are not necessarily physical. And when you experience that, I know a lot of people have said, well, that's almost worse than a physical type of pain. And so that's one of the experiences of hell, is having that spiritual pain, like an ache, not in the body, but in the mind, in the soul, in the intellect, and the will. A sixth type of suffering in hell is darkness and stench. There's no light all around, and the stench is just overwhelming. All of your senses are affected by being in hell. Finally, the last suffering of hell from St. Faustina is hearing curses and blasphemies and such hatred of God. You'll never hear a comforting word. You'll never hear anything that's beautiful, no music. In fact, C.S. Lewis said, "In heaven there is music and there is silence. In hell there is only noise." So these types of sufferings of hell are just immensely awful. And a lot of people say, well, how can a good God send someone to hell? But you have to understand, people choose it freely, of their own free will. And going to hell is actually less of a suffering than it would be for someone who hates God to go to heaven. I remember one time when I was a kid, I was going camping, and all of the other Boy Scouts I was camping with, they had to hike 4 miles into the campsite, but I had to go to Mass. It was a Saturday night, so I went to Mass and then got driven straight to the campsite. And I was talking with one of the boys who was asking me, why'd you not hike with us? And I said, well, I had to go to Mass first. He said, you went to Mass? I'd rather hike 400 miles than go to Mass. I was like, whoa, what? You'd rather do anything rather than be in the presence of God and receive Jesus? But that's exactly what a soul who is condemned to hell thinks, is they would rather do anything than be in the presence of God. And so hell is actually God's mercy, because God says, look, I don't want to torture you for eternity to be in the presence of someone that you hate. So here's a place where you can be without me for eternity. I really believe if the souls of the damned were brought to heaven, they would suffer immensely more, because their wills are completely turned against God. They don't want to do God's will. They don't want to love. They want to be wrapped up in their selfishness and in their hate. And so hell is an act of God's mercy. In addition to hell, though, there's many of us who are going to die who perhaps are stained. They're imperfect. And so God provided a place where we can be cleansed so we can love Him perfectly in heaven. And that place is called Purgatory. Purgatory, too, is a great act of God's mercy. Because imagine this for a moment. Imagine that you were out cutting the lawn. You ever use one of those push mowers? So you're getting all hot and sweaty, and you're starting to smell like grease and oil and grass. And someone runs up to you and says, guess what? The Pope wants to have lunch with you in 10 minutes. Well, what are you going to say? And I said, whoa, let me shower first. I don't want to come seeing the Pope dressed like this in my ratty, sweat-soaked shirt. You're going to want to clean up. In the same way, if we just walked into heaven with all of the stain of sin that clung to us, we would be embarrassed. We'd be ashamed. And God doesn't want any shame in heaven. He doesn't want anything that's going to separate us from him. And so he gave us this place called Purgatory. Now, Purgatory is in the Bible. Look up 2 Maccabees chapter 12, and you'll see where Purgatory is very clearly written in the Bible, which means that if it's in the Bible, we can place our faith in it. This is not something that's just an invention of the church, but actually comes from the Word of God to have a place called Purgatory. Finally, though, let's talk about heaven. Heaven is going to be wonderful. I cannot wait, and I trust that God is going to bring me there. The greatest joy of heaven is the beatific vision. It's a fancy way of saying seeing God for all eternity. And that's going to be absolutely amazing. Now, a lot of times we have this view of heaven that sounds really boring. We're going to sit on clouds, strumming harps. That doesn't sound fun. Who wants to do that for eternity? But consider this. Think about the person you love the most in your life. Maybe it's your mom or dad. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it's a family member or a friend. Think about never ever being separated from them. Think about hanging out with them forever. Think about, not seeing them for a long period of time, 10, 20, 30 years, and then being reunited with them. What an joyous reaction that's going to be when we see them again. And that's what it is in heaven. We have longed for God. We've stretched our hearts so much because we want him. We desire him. And then finally we get to have him. We get to see him. Think about the most joyous experience you've had on this earth and multiply that times infinity. And that's what heaven is going to be like. Now, there are other joys of heaven. We get to see our family and friends. We have the company of the angels. We're going to enjoy physical comfort as well. So we believe that at the end of time, we're going to receive our bodies back in a glorified form. We call that our glorified body because it's in and through our bodies that we practice virtue or commit sin, right? If I want to show my love for someone, I use my body. I hug them, I kiss them, I shake their hand. If I want to show that I hate someone, I use my body. I punch them, or I use my tongue to speak ill words of them. So in the same way, because our bodies are so integral towards our good actions or our bad actions, our body is also going to share in either the reward or the suffering that we're going to go through. So in heaven, our glorified bodies are going to be utterly transformed. There's not going to be any flaw. There's not going to be any sickness, any suffering. And a lot of people ask, well, what age will I be in heaven? I think you're definitely going to be yourself, but you will be timeless. You will have the best of all ages. Because, I had much better skin when I was 5 years old, and I had better hair when I was a teenager, but, more muscles later on in life. So you'll kind of have the best of all worlds when you're in heaven. Finally, at the very end of time, when our glorified bodies rise again and are reunited with our souls, we're going to experience what's called the final judgment. Now, it's not that we're rejudged, but rather that we're going to see the effects of all of our actions and how our actions changed human history. I have a great story for that. When I was in seminary, I had a buddy across the hall from mine. His name was Clinton, and he just constantly complained about absolutely everything. He said, the food is terrible and the professors are awful and I hate living here and, the room is uncomfortable. And he just never had anything good to say. And so finally one day he's in my room, we're just chatting and he's complaining about something else. And I was just tired of it. So I got up and I said, Clinton, you know what? I'm just going to go and pray. Just stop complaining. And he said, can you go pray for me? And I said, no, you go pray for yourself. And later on, I was kind of like, wow, man, that was kind of mean to say that, right? Go pray for yourself. So fast forward 3 years. He's about to be ordained a priest. And he came to me one day and he said, Joe, I have to thank you. And I said, for what? He said, you saved my vocation. It's like, what in the world are you talking about? And he said, remember that day you told me to go pray for myself? I said, yeah, I was being a total jerk. And he said, no. I actually started thinking about that and I thought, you're absolutely right. The reason I'm complaining is because I don't have a real relationship with Jesus. So from that day on, I started to really pray for myself and get to know Christ. And I thought, whoa, here I was thinking I was just being a total jerk. And that's what we're going to find out at the end of time is how every word we spoke, every thought we thought, every action that we performed has had an eternal consequence on the history of the world. Maybe that word that you spoke to somebody, that positive word, gave them the strength to continue another day when they were thinking about killing themselves. Maybe that insult that you hurled at somebody ended up destroying their life later on, and that just kind of continued to collapse their self-esteem, and so they turned to drugs or alcohol. Who knows what those small actions have done? But we're going to find that out at the final judgment, which is something that I can't wait for, as long as, hopefully, my life has been very positive on this earth. But the one thing I want you to take away is that eternity is certain. There's not too many other certain things in this world, but we know that we're going to die, and we know that there's going to be an afterlife, which means that this life matters. What we do here on this earth has eternal repercussions, so live your life well. For Catholic Truth, I'm Father Joseph Gill. Thanks so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe, and if you get a chance, go on iTunes or Spotify and look me up for my latest CD, Until Eternity Dawns, which came out in December 2019.